Hi, I'm Rohith. I have made some updates to my 3D tank game, and basically I've implemented the MVC design pattern for the tank player, right? And we'll be looking at what the MVC is and how I've implemented it in the project, and an extended version of MVC called the MVCS. And yeah, let's just I'll show you what I've done. So last time during the last update, I created a tank controller script and implemented the tank movement. So this time it's the same, but thing is, there's a, you can see that there's a tank spawner which has an enemy count. So I can drop in any number of enemies like the count, and within a certain area, those number of enemies would be spawned. So uh, like this is one of the effects of, like, one of the perks of using MVC. And yeah, so I can see that there are like 10 tanks instantiated, right? So we'll just look at how the architecture is, right? And before that I'll explain what MVC is. So MVC is a design pattern, and this is basically what is this whole thing is a summary of MVC. So it separates an application into three interconnected components: the model, view, and controller. So MVC is basically model, right, and view, and finally controller. So this the hierarchy would be like, uh, when we are implementing MVC, right? So controller would be at the top. The sense it 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 is the script that relates both model and view. So model and view cannot communicate with each other, right? But they both communicate with the controller, which can communicate with both model and view. So it is a two-way communication, right? And yeah, so this is how the architecture would be in the high level, right? So view will start with view. So view is what uh, the user sees. So user interface, it can be the player model, it can be the buttons on the UI, etc., right? And model is the data part. So if you have a player, for instance, in a game like Clash of Clans or something, if you have a character, then there are certain attributes associated with the character, so health, damage value, etc. So that those kind of data would be stored in the model, right? And controller is what contains the main logic, right? So the controller gets the input from the view. So the user interacts with the view, right? So uh, the user gives input to the view, right? And that view goes to the controller. The controller does some logic, right? And it takes its required information from the model, and using that, it'll come up with a what execution, right? And that can be executed by the view component itself, right? So that's the whole idea of MVC. We are splitting things into uh, departments, right? So anything associated with showing to the user and communicating with the user will go in view, whereas anything associated with storing data, retrieving data will go in model, and controller is where all the logic happens, all the uh, calculations and stuff, right? Yeah, so that's the whole thing about model, controller, and view. And when you're implementing in Unity, so there are like three scripts here, right? Simply there are three scripts. So a controller script, model script, and view script. But the thing is, only view script would be mono behavior. So this one would be a mono behavior, uh, in the sense that view can be attached to a game object, right? And it is present in the scene, whereas both controller and model are not mono behavior. and that's because they don't have what they are not present in the scene, right? They are present, but they do not have a game object associated with it. They don't require to be attached to a game object. So there is no point of adding a mono behavior or deriving from the mono behavior. This will like lessen the burden, right? So you have multiple scripts, but you're only having one mono behavior what reference, right? So mono behavior by itself is a big class, so including that like deriving from it would be very heavy. So it's better to minimize using mono behavior, and that way these scripts would be lightweight, right? So we only have functions that are required in these controller and model scripts. And yeah so so that's basically MVC. And like there are multiple like versions of MVC, right? And one version of it is the MVCS. So the same it's the same thing, a model view controller, but there's an extra model view controller, that's an extra S, and this S stands for service, right? So basically any application we take, we can like split it into some compartments, right? So in my case, I could say let me for instance, I could have a menu UI. That's one set of like there's a certain set of operations in there, right? And there's the game logic. So the game timer, the win lose conditions, etc. And then there's my player tank, right? Tank related stuff. So tank, and then there is maybe bullet or something like that, right? And so there are like what compartments to uh, any application we take. So each of these compartments might have their own MVCs. So my tank compartment might have a tank MVC, and it can also, so we can put both of these in a game what game loop, right? Game loop thing. We can put both tank and bullet inside this, so it comes under game loop. So tank might have an MVC, and bullet might have an MVC also, right? So let's see, menu UI might have some I don't know, main menu something, right? And the whole point of this is when you have these compartments, right? These are all separate from each other. So you don't want these MVCs to communicate with MVCs of other compartments. So there's no point, like you should not allow that to happen, because that will increase coupling. So basically any change of code in one area will affect the other, like other departments, right? Other compartments, and you will have to go there and change that too. So in order to prevent that, we can go for MVCS, which is a higher level of MVC, where there is like here you can see controller, model, and view. So there is another like thing above this called the service, right? And this service basically it has access to this controller, like it can what create instances of this from this MVC, right? So it can communicate with this MVC as a whole, right? And basically we can have different services for different compartments. So for instance, uh, m- main menu. So main menu has a start button, right? So this start button, and let me just, so we have the main menu, and let this be the main menu, right? Main menu, and let this be the game logic or game loop something, right? And under this I have the tank MVC, and under here I have the menu MVC, something like that, right? And basically I'm now I am clicking start in here. So this menu MVC would communicate with the main menu. So the main menu is as a service, right? So service will now uh, communicate with game loop. So that's another service, right? So service is able to communicate with the MVC under it and other services. And this game loop will now, okay, so I have to start the game, and it will call a function and it will communicate with the tank MVC to finally create a tank, right? So now you have spawned a player tank. And when you are implementing this in Unity, we'll be making these services as a singleton, right? So because they are a singleton, only one service can exist at a time, and because they are singletons, they can communicate with other singletons, right? So yeah, so that's the entire thing about MVCs. And cool. We look at what how I have implemented it in the game, right? So this is the tank scripts. So I have put all the scripts related to the tank in it, and you can see the four scripts, uh, right? Controller, model, view, and service, right? So let's start with the service, because service is the most top thing, right? And so I have used the generic singleton from the last like update, and I passed in tank service. Now, so now tank service is a singleton, right? And basically, at the start of the scene, I am creating a player tank. So we'll just look at this for now. I'm creating a player tank. So clear player tank will basically it'll create a tank controller, right? So it is creating a tank controller, and as you had seen here, so the service is creating a tank controller, right? So tank controller will now is responsible to create both the model and the view, right? And that's what we'll be doing in the constructor. So I'll be passing the tank prefab and some values for the tank controller to so that it can create the model and the view, right? So we talked about what a view is and what model is. So model needs some data, and view needs uh, what a prefab, right? So it needs a game object, and that's what we are passing here. So tank prefab is a game object, and because that's tank view, it means a game object that contains the tank view script, right? And this data, this is what I'm passing for the model, right? So we'll go to tank controller. So tank controller, or we'll just look at what the tank prefab is, right? So prefabs, okay. So this is the tank prefab, and this is the same as what I had during last time. So it has a rigid body, it has a box collider, and I have frozen the rotation in X and Z axis. And this thing has the tank view script. So because it has the tank view script, I can uh, pass it into the tank prefab, right? And yeah, cool. So that's the tank prefab, and with that tank prefab that I passed here, I can instantiate the tank view, uh, right, and get the reference to it. So the tank controller has, like, it must create two things, the tank model and tank view. So tank model, it will create using the data that I have provided in the parameters, right? So that's what I have done here. Here tank model equals new tank model speed health. So we'll just look at a brief look at tank model. Tank model has two data right now, for now, right? And the constructor takes sets the two values, right? And tank view, on the other hand, uh, wait, so tank view, yeah, so tank view was contains what I had in the last update. It basically the tank control. So tank view is responsible for getting the input, right? So that's what is happening here, and it has a reference to the rigid body, right? And it has two float values to get the input. So the controller is now creating two things: tank view and tank model. And what I'll explain what I've done here. So because I have two types of tanks, so the enemy tank and the player tank, I am passing different arguments, right? So there are things that I want to be different for the player and things that I want to be different for the enemy. So for the player, I want the main camera to follow the player, and I want the joystick to control the player, right? So this one, okay. So this thing that I'm controlling, right? You see that this is the player, and all the other ones are enemies, right? So the player that I'm controlling, the camera also follows it. So I'll have to make two separate, like, uh, what constructor calls, right? And that's what I'm doing here. I'll show you in the service. I have a public enum to specify what type of player or what type of tank it is. So if it's player tank or enemy tank, and basically I'll be sending when creating the player tank, I'll send the player tank type, and when creating enemy tank, I'll send enemy tank type. So along with the player tank type, I'll send the joystick. So the reference to the joystick, this one, right? So tank spawner has so this is the joystick. So I have just given the joystick as reference, and another thing is the camera, right? So I have added the camera rig to the main camera. So now when I'm creating the player, I want to send I want the reference to both joystick and the main camera, because that's what like the player would need input from the joystick, and the main camera would need the transform of the player, right? So in the other hand, I have the enemy tank. So enemy tank needs so this is just the range. So it doesn't need the joystick, it doesn't need the main camera. It needs the range for where it should spawn, right? These are the x and y values within which the enemies get spawned, right? And that's what is happening here. So tank type, if tank type is player, then I just have to instantiate uh, the player at that center of the, like, at the origin, right? And if I'm instantiating enemy, then I have to pass in random position vector, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I'm passing a random x and z value from the constructor parameters, and quantity identity, so that it's not rotating, right? And yeah, so here right here I'm setting camera controller. So I have the camera controller, I have the main camera, and I'm setting main camera's transform to tank view data transfer. So I'll just show you the camera controller. So this is the camera controller script, and basically it takes the transform of the player, and it adds it to its current player, right? It, like, wherever the player moves, that camera also moves. So it needs the transform of the player. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm setting the transform to the view that is the player tanks transform, right? So now I have created tank view and I have created tank model. So both these scripts are active now, right? And the thing is, we have to, like, in order to communicate between so controller has to communicate to model, and controller has to communicate with view. So now, right now, we have the reference to tank view and tank model. So this direction, it's able to communicate. So controller is able to communicate a model, and controller is able to communicate with view. But we have to establish this reverse communication, right? So from view to controller and from model to controller. So for that, view needs a reference to the controller, and model needs a reference to the controller. So that's what we'll be doing up next. So tank model needs a tank controller reference and tank view needs a tank controller reference. So the way we'll be setting it is using a public function. So set tank controller and the argument will be a tank controller, and same for the model, right? And in the constructor itself, after creating both these tank view and tank model, I'll just set the control tank controller to this instance, right? This tank controller instance, and that's basically what we are doing here. And the tank view, I'm setting the tank type because I want to ignore the input for the enemy, right? So that's why I'm sending the tank type and storing it here, and I'll be using that to ignore the player input, right? Asking for input, and let's see. So that's done. Finally, if joystick is not null, then I'll set tank view is joystick. So okay, so this can be included here itself in under tank time equal to player, so that can be done. It's the same. And lastly, in order to, so this one I'll explain it in a bit. So now we have tank controller, and both tank service and tank model has reference to the tank controller. So basically we have established the two-way communication, right? And at this point we just have to implement, I'll have to implement the movement, right? So tank view gets the player input. So if the tank is a player, then it gets the player input from the joystick that I have passed, that I have set, right? So it gets the input, and if the input is like not zero, then it must like uh, it must send these values to the controller. So controller is what is responsible for making the decisions, like making like doing the calculations, right? So it must send these values to the controller. So tank controller that move tank, and I'm passing both the float values, both horizontal and vertical. So tank controller has this function which receives both these values, and its job is like what I had done in the last one. I just modified it. So direction, it finds the direction, and yeah. So this here, right here, I've used tank model dot speed. So in order to set the speed, I have because okay, so okay, so user gives input here, right here, right, and it goes to the controller. Controller now has to make the decision how far to go, right? And for that he needs a speed, and that speed is retrieved from the model, right? And with that data, he is now able to, the controller is now able to calculate how far to go, and that must be implemented on the rigid body, right? So the rigid body is present in the in the view, right? So view has the rigid body, and to in order to modify like use its functions, it need the controller needs a reference to this. So for that we'll just use a get rigid body function, and that's basically what we are doing in the constructor. So we are rb is equal to tank view dot get rigid body. So we now have rb, so we can set rb velocity, and views velocity will be changed, so we can play around with the uh, move tank, right? So that's basically what I've done the whole thing, and yeah, so yeah, so that's the whole thing that I've done. We'll probably have to make different MVCs for other what game related things, right? For bullets maybe and other stuff. So yeah, thanks for watching.